They got a quiet thrill from watching Kayla Maddox scrub other people's plates, like her life was something disposable you could rinse down a drain, and that pleasure lasted exactly as long as it took a door to swing open. Because the man who stepped into the Castellane Hotel that night wasn't just the gala's prized donor, he was the one whose money owned the marble under their heels, and whose shadow could swallow the room whole. In the basement kitchen, steel pans clanged, bleach stung the air, and steam curled up like fog trying to hide faces that didn't want to be seen, while Kayla, a 27-year-old woman, shaped by foster homes and overdue bills, stood at the sink with raw, reddened hands, and her jaw set in the kind of silence that meant she was counting, remembering, surviving. The other temps kept their eyes down, terrified that even looking at her would earn them a cut shift and an empty fridge, and only Jade Rios, a young single mom from the pastry station, dared to lean in and whisper something kind, the way you offer a match in a storm. But kindness didn't get to grow. Brielle Lang, the woman running the gala upstairs, glided into the kitchen with a smile sharp enough to draw blood without touching skin, her gaze pinning Kayla like a trophy she'd already won, and she didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. She simply arranged the humiliation like centerpieces on a table. "Take these glasses to the ballroom," Brielle said, sweet as champagne, cruel as a verdict, "so you can see what you'll never have." Kayla lifted the tray and stepped through the service door that split two worlds in half. Outside was warm jazz, crystal light, and laughter that sounded expensive. And inside that glow, she became a shadow with a name tag that wasn't hers. Guests accepted the glasses without meeting her eyes, and one man joked that a single flute cost more than her rent, then laughed like it was clever. At the head table, Margot Vascari, polished and untouchable, lifted her gaze, and for one heartbeat her eyes flickered with recognition before the feeling snapped shut into perfect, icy composure, as if Kayla were just another worker passing by. Then Brielle took the microphone to honor the staff with words that sounded like praise and landed like a slap. And right as the room leaned into the joke, the main doors opened. The music didn't stop, but the air changed. People with money stood up on instinct. Servers straightened like they'd been trained by fear. And every gaze made space as Grant Vascari walked in. 37, immaculate, ruthless, the kind of man who didn't need to shout because the room already knew what silence meant around him. He moved past the head table, past the smiles and handshakes, then turned his head toward the service entrance like he'd felt a pull in his bones, and his eyes locked on Kayla, holding an empty tray like it was the last shield she had left. His face didn't show surprise. It showed anger compressed into something colder than winter, and in that second, Kayla closed her eyes, because she finally understood that whatever her husband really was, tonight wasn't going to let her stay ignorant anymore. If you're hooked, hit like to support the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark twists and slow burn tension. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will change everything. But here's the question that should scare you most. Why did Margot recognize Kayla before Grant did? And what did she already set in motion beneath the Castellane's gleaming lights? The service door had barely swung shut behind Kayla when the humiliation out in the lobby felt like it had been snapped in two and hurled straight into the basement, replaced by the damp, chemical chill of the back corridor, where harsh white fluorescent lights made skin look paper pale, and every footstep sounded too loud. Cynthia appeared like a hand around a throat, yanking Kayla by the wrist toward internal HR, her nails biting into flesh like she meant to leave a mark, her voice low and rough, not needing to shout to make it clear this was law, not temper. She snarled that Kayla must think she was somebody to pull a stunt in front of a crowd. That one phone call was all it would take for the agency to make her vanish from every shift in the city. And when Kayla tried to reach into her apron pocket, Cynthia snatched it first, ripped the phone away like she was tearing off a vital piece of life, slipped it into her own jacket, then leaned in close and whispered that a temporary server had no right to record, no right to explain, no right to play the victim, and if Kayla wanted to keep having money for her family's medicine, she'd better learn how to bow her head. Kayla didn't beg. She kept her eyes steady, as if she were looking through Cynthia and measuring the distance to the emergency exit, measuring the camera mounted in the ceiling corner, measuring the guard's patrol rhythm by the radio chatter threading through the ice machine's grind. Because she'd lived too long in makeshift places where everything could be stolen in a single careless second, and she understood that right now the most valuable thing wasn't pride, it was data, it was the way out, it was whatever she could keep inside her head when her hands were left empty. Jade came running after them, panicked, her kitchen shoes skimming on the wet floor, trying to wedge herself in and say Kayla had only followed orders to carry the tray out, that Brielle was the one who'd pushed it, that if anyone deserved blame, it was the person who'd staged the whole thing. But Cynthia snapped around, her stare sharp as a razor, and threw Jade a line that hit like a slap, that if a single mother like her wanted to keep her shifts, then she shouldn't learn the habit of playing hero. Then she lowered her voice and pressed exactly where it hurt, reminding her that hours could be cut, tips could be cut, and daycare could stop taking her child with nothing more than a few whispers. Jade went pale and fell silent like she'd been strangled, and Kayla saw her shoulders start to shake, small and thin like a receipt being torn, and in that instant, Kayla swallowed the hot burn of rage, because she knew if Jade got crushed right now, she'd lose the only person who dared to stand beside her. Cynthia dragged Kayla past a row of metal doors that only opened with key cards, past the changing room, the linen room, the supply closet, and Kayla memorized every sign, every handle, every blind spot where the camera couldn't sweep because a ventilation duct blocked its view, and she also saw a gray-painted door with no nameplate, only an electronic lock and a small pane of glass, dark and dull like a dead fisheye. Cynthia positioned her right in front of that door like she was setting down a warning, saying this was a zone only management could enter, and if Kayla thought she could slip outside and spin a story, she'd better remember that in this hotel, every passage had someone guarding it, and every story could be squeezed down to fit the interests of the people holding power. Kayla didn't answer, but she heard, above them through the ceiling and the ductwork, the music still drifting along as if nothing had happened, and she pictured Grant somewhere in that sea of crystal light, not rushing in to save her, not calling her name, just standing still like a cold cut, as if he were waiting for the exact moment to break the whole room in half. The thought made Kayla feel safe, and made her shake inside in a way she couldn't quite name, because if he really was the kind of man everyone made space for, then his silence wasn't indifference, it was calculation, and a man like Grant almost never calculated for the sake of making anyone happy. Cynthia stopped, turned to face Kayla, blocking the way like a wall that breathed, and said slowly that Kayla had two choices. 1. Go back to the kitchen, silent as if she'd never stepped into the lobby. Finish her shift and disappear. 2. Get written up as a troublemaker, get thrown out tonight, and have her name sent to every agency Cynthia had ties with. Kayla glanced at the pocket where her phone had just been stolen, then at Jade, at the desperation that had been forced into silence. And she understood the fight had just shifted from humiliation to control, from polished laughter to something dirtier, quieter, more dangerous, where nobody needed a microphone to ruin someone. They only needed a phone call to the right person at the right hour, and Kayla knew she had to stay calm like she was holding on to her life, had to remember every door, every dark corner, and had to get back what Cynthia had taken, because if she didn't reclaim the right to tell her own story, tonight would swallow her the way a drain swallowed a drop of water, smooth and clean enough that nobody would ever see it. Cynthia had barely finished her threat when the back hallway felt like someone snapped its breathing in half. The radio chatter in the ceiling corner suddenly went quiet, and heavy but steady footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor like a clock that didn't need to hurry to make people move aside, and Kayla recognized the shift before she even saw a face, because the security staff who'd been leaning on the wall like they were guarding a storage bay straightened at once, hands leaving their belts, eyes flicking fast like soldiers who'd just received an order. Then a man in a dark coat stepped into the fluorescent spill with a walk that wasn't rushed at all, yet made the space automatically retreat. Grant Viscari didn't need to raise his voice. One glance was enough to make Cynthia hitch like someone had yanked a wire. Half a step behind him was Miles Keene, his face flat as blank paper, holding a thin file folder, and Kayla saw in both of them the cold order of people who were used to controlling consequences. Grant stopped in front of the gray-painted door with no nameplate, his eyes sliding over the electronic lock before settling on Cynthia's jacket pocket, where Kayla's phone was tucked. He didn't ask. He didn't get loud in the usual way anger did. He only said one short sentence, like placing a heavy piece of metal on the floor. "Give it back, right now, and step out of the way." The words were simple, but the nearest guard immediately moved, as if programmed. Cynthia still tried to protest, saying this was procedure, that she was following policy, that she didn't know who Kayla was. But Miles leaned slightly and tipped his gaze to the other guard, and the two of them shifted at the same time, pinning Cynthia into a narrow pocket of space, just wide enough for her to understand she no longer controlled the rhythm. Cynthia shook, with fury, with fear, with the shock of being stripped of authority inside her own territory. And in that panic, she let something slip that Kayla heard like scissors cutting straight through reality. Cynthia rasped that she couldn't treat Kayla Maddox like a normal temp employee when HR had a sealed file, a separate packet locked away, stamped in red, with instructions not to open it unless you were senior management, and that she'd been forced to keep everything in the right place so tonight would pass smoothly. The moment the words landed, Kayla felt cold spread through her, because the last name Maddox wasn't something anyone at this hotel should have known, and it wasn't something that belonged inside a sealed file, and she understood then that a legal footprint of hers had been pressed into this place long before she ever came through the service door, only she'd never been told, never been asked to sign, never been given a choice. Kayla looked at Grant, wanting to ask right then, wanting to tear the silence between them wide open, but Grant didn't give her an explanation. He only looked at her the way you looked at a wound that had to be bandaged before it was exposed to predators. His gaze paused half a second too long on Kayla's wrist, where Cynthia's nails had left a red mark. Then he turned to Cynthia, his voice low and even, and said every camera covering this area had to have its data sealed immediately. Nobody was to delete or edit anything. And from this moment on, Cynthia had no authority to order anyone in relation to Kayla. That made Cynthia let out a sharp, bitter laugh, trying to claw back some dignity. But the laugh broke off when Grant stepped one pace deeper into her personal space, close enough that she had to look up, and Kayla saw clearly that the most frightening thing wasn't Cynthia's threats. It was the way other people obeyed Grant, like a survival reflex. Miles opened the file folder, not handing it to Kayla, only letting the edge of a document show with an official seal, just enough for Kayla to know Cynthia hadn't invented it. Then Miles said very quietly that there were things that shouldn't be spoken here, not because the secret was shameful, but because there were ears listening, people waiting for one careless sentence to turn Kayla into a target, and Kayla felt an invisible warning rise around her, as if the truth didn't only hurt, it could kill. Kayla clenched her hand and took her phone back from the guard, the screen dark, then stared straight at Grant, her voice steady but cold, asking why her name was inside a sealed file at this hotel. Grant didn't answer that question right away. He only said, "Come with me, now, and don't say another word in front of anyone from the hotel." The words sounded like an order, but also like a shield, and Kayla wanted to resist, yet she had to admit something that stabbed in her chest, that his silence wasn't simple avoidance. It felt like a warning, as if something was stalking behind this wall, and if she dragged the truth out too soon, it would bite. Grant led Kayla through a narrow turn where the music from the ballroom was reduced to a faint tremor inside the ventilation ducts. Miles followed behind like a shadow that knew how to lock every door that needed locking, and Kayla tried to keep her breathing even, though her mind kept circling one question about sealed records like a hooked blade. But the moment her phone lit up again in her hand, a small vibration yanked her out of Grant's secrets and threw her straight back into the real life that belonged to her. The screen showed a missed call from the kidney clinic where Jonah was being monitored, then a voicemail she hadn't listened to yet, and Jonah's name alone was enough to make Kayla's throat go dry and raw, like she'd swallowed metal dust. She slowed, half a step away from Grant, pressed the phone to her ear, and the nurse's voice came through, steady, routine, yet every word struck her chest. The message said today's tests showed unstable numbers. The doctor wanted Jonah to come back sooner, that missing follow-up appointments and medication would raise the risk, and at the same time, the payment system was on hold because an old balance hadn't been resolved. They needed insurance confirmation or a deposit. The voice ended with that familiar line, cold as procedure, asking her to call back as soon as possible. Kayla stood still in the back hallway, fluorescent light pouring down over her face and making every trace of exhaustion visible. And in that moment, her fear had nothing to do with the humiliation in the ballroom or Margot's eyes, or the way Grant had entered like a silent storm. Her fear was something painfully ordinary, painfully American, cruel in the way paperwork could be. The fear that if she didn't have money and proof, Jonah would be pulled into a loop of delays, and delays in a hospital could feel like a sentence hanging around a poor person's neck. Grant looked at Kayla and saw her face change color. He started to step closer, but Kayla lifted her hand, not to push him away, but to hold distance for one beat, just long enough for her to steady herself. She said, very briefly, that her little brother needed her right now, and those words made Miles lower his gaze, as if he understood the kind of weight power couldn't sweep aside with a look. That was when Jade finally dared to drift closer from the end of the corridor. She'd followed Kayla like she was holding onto a lifeline, her eyes red from fear of losing her shifts. And when she saw Kayla listening to the voicemail, Jade understood this wasn't theater, it was survival. She pulled Kayla close to the wall, where the camera couldn't catch everything, speaking fast but low, saying Cynthia didn't just bully people, she skimmed money. Tips were held back in envelopes and split the way Cynthia wanted. Anyone who asked questions got their hours cut. Anyone who pushed back got shoved into the worst shifts until they quit on their own, and it was all hidden behind a payroll book and timesheets locked inside the payroll log room, a place only managers could open with a keycard. Jade said she'd seen Cynthia change the hours right before the data was submitted, and once she'd overheard Cynthia bragging that the agency would take care of troublemakers, meaning they wouldn't get called for work again. Kayla listened to every word like she was listening to a countdown, and she realized the thing squeezing Jade's throat was the same thing squeezing Jonah's. It wasn't only one petty tyrant. It was an entire system that knew how to use poverty as a rope. And if Kayla left this place with nothing but a vague explanation from Grant, then tomorrow Cynthia would still be standing in that kitchen. Jade would still be bowing her head, and Jonah would still be suspended between a bill and an appointment slot. Kayla lifted her eyes to Grant, and her gaze wasn't only hurt from being kept in the dark. It was a cold decision. She said she needed evidence, not to play the hero, but to have leverage, because in this city people respected paperwork and risk. And if she wanted to protect her brother and people like Jade, she had to hold something that made them fear losing more than she feared getting fired. Grant didn't argue. He only looked at Miles, like a signal that time was running, then looked back at Kayla as if he were weighing protection against control. Finally, he said very quietly, "Don't risk your life." But Kayla answered, not loud, yet hard as thin steel, that she'd been risking her life her whole life. Tonight she only wanted to risk it in the right place. Then she slid her phone back into her pocket, wiped the corner of her eye fast, like erasing a trace of softness she wasn't allowed to show, turned to Jade, and told her to lead the way to the payroll log room, and while the music upstairs kept drifting on like a polished lie, Kayla began to walk with the feeling that she wasn't choosing between dignity and humiliation anymore. She was choosing between living and being crushed. In the ballroom above, everything kept moving as if it were a piece of music hired to cover the breathing of the weak. Crystal lights scattered over expensive dresses and tuxedos like sugar dusted over dessert, and Margot Vascari stood at the edge of the hall, never staying in the center of the crowd longer than necessary, because women like her didn't need attention. They only needed to control what would be given attention. Margot held a champagne flute but barely drank. She used her gaze in place of everything, sweeping over the round tables where people laughed, where they discussed donations the way they discussed weather, where they looked down at the service level the way they looked down into a foreign basement, and in every glance Margot saw clearly what bothered her most. It wasn't that Kayla had been mocked. It was that Kayla had stayed standing, hadn't broken, hadn't begged, as if poverty couldn't force her to bow all the way. Margot glanced toward the service door where Grant had vanished from the room, and the moment he turned away wasn't to chase after a flower that had been stepped on. It was to protect what belonged to him in the way of a man who never let a crowd see him lose control. Margot understood her son better than anyone there. The quieter Grant became, the more dangerous he was. The less he revealed, the more ready he was to destroy whatever irritated him. That was exactly why Margot needed Kayla gone from his life, before Kayla turned into a weakness an enemy could grab, and before Kayla turned into a moral line that might change the way Grant used power. She walked slowly along the corridor beside the stage, where the music softened into background, and stopped near a wall dressed in white flowers, as if she were only checking the program schedule, then tipped her head and told Brielle Lang, who stood near the bar, that tonight had been enough. The sentence was light as wind, but it carried the weight of an order. Brielle gave a small laugh, the laugh of someone who was used to pushing other people down to feel taller. She started to ask if Margot wanted her to stage one more scene, but Margot didn't answer directly. She only said Kayla was a risk, a mistake that shouldn't be allowed to stretch on, that the Vascari legacy couldn't be tied to a girl who'd come out of the foster system, with medical debt and poverty stories that made this world uncomfortable to hear, and that if Grant was pulled toward that softness, every enemy would smell blood. Brielle understood instantly. She didn't need a long explanation. She only needed permission, and Margot's permission always arrived in its most polite form. Margot left Brielle and moved toward the private corridor reserved for high-level guests, where hotel security nodded with respectful deference. She passed through as if she owned the hallway, even if the paperwork said otherwise. And when the thick walls cut the music away, Margot took out her phone. The screen showed no name, only a number she hadn't saved. She dialed, waited exactly 3 rings, then spoke in a voice so calm it sounded like she was placing an order, saying the Western Service entrance would be opened for a short window, long enough for whoever needed to go in, long enough for whoever needed to go out. And she needed everything clean, quiet, leaving no trace in the ballroom, because she didn't want the press, she didn't want New York police, and she wanted least of all the people who hunted scandal to have a chance to turn tonight into entertainment. On the other end, no one asked Kayla's name, no one asked for the purpose. They only asked which door, what time, because that was the language of people who lived by doors and timing. Margot answered with a precision that made the skin prickle, saying there would be a gap when the service team changed shifts, when Cynthia was busy handling logistics, and when Grant was still downstairs. She spoke as if she were only confirming a schedule, but beneath the words was cold arithmetic. She wanted a threat that was just enough, not to kill, but to frighten Kayla. To make Kayla understand that staying near Grant meant the world would bite her first. To make Kayla retreat on her own without Margot ever having to dirty her hands. She ended the call and stood still for a moment, watching her own reflection in the glass, straightening her pearl bracelet as if order on the outside could cover chaos on the inside, then returned to the ballroom with the proper smile, as if she hadn't just made a phone call that could change the direction of a few human lives. When Margot stepped back into the light, laughter flowed around her again, greetings were offered again, and she answered with polished courtesies, while inside she heard only one thing, the sound of legacy, the sound of power insisting on keeping its shape. Far across the room, Brielle had already started leaning in close to a few people, releasing whispers poisonous enough to spread fast. A story about a temporary worker with issues, about someone trying to climb by causing trouble, and Margot watched it the way you watched black ink bleed into water. She didn't stop it, because she needed it. She needed Kayla isolated, doubted, pushed into a state where she could no longer stand on dignity but had to stand on fear. Margot lifted the glass and let her lips touch it, still not drinking, and in the moment the jazz slid through the room like a lullaby. She thought of the look Grant had given the service door, thought of the cold set of his face, and told herself that once Kayla disappeared, everything would return to its proper place, like a banquet table being reset after a server had dropped a glass. Only Margot didn't realize some glasses didn't shatter into pieces. They shattered into sound, and that sound was loud enough to wake an empire. While the music upstairs still coated everything in a sweet layer of sugar to hide the smell of iron, Kayla stayed close behind Jade through narrow routes only staff knew, where the tile floor was slick with moisture and pipes ran along the ceiling like the veins of a giant beast. Jade didn't talk much anymore. She only breathed too fast and kept looking over her shoulder, as if Cynthia could grow out of any door, while Kayla kept her phone inside her apron pocket like a small knife, not letting it vibrate, not letting it light up, because she understood light could betray you, too. They stopped in front of a door lower than the others, cream paint peeling, scratch marks on the handle from years of being yanked open in a hurry. Jade pulled a thin plastic card from her sock. Not an official badge, just a strip of magnetic card she'd secretly kept back from the days she'd been sent to deliver envelopes. She pressed it to the reader, heard a soft click, and immediately tugged Kayla inside before the lock could snap back. The payroll log room was colder than the hallway. The air conditioner ran steadily with a restrained hiss, and the smell of old paper, printer ink, and the dusty breath of numbers buried for too long rose into the light. A white lamp shone down on a row of filing cabinets, a small safe, and a desk crowded with ledgers. Jade's hands shook as she shut the door and slid the bolt. Then she stood still as if listening, and only when no footsteps came close did she whisper that Cynthia came in here every week, changed hours before submitting them to the system, kept tips in envelopes and split them according to attitude ratings. And anyone who asked too many questions got their name written onto the shift-cutting list. Kayla went to the desk, opened the top drawer, and found a thick time log. Lines of names and shifts filled the pages, with a red marker beside them. She flipped fast with the instinct of someone who'd read contracts before, her eyes catching the places crossed out, the hour totals altered in a different hand, the strange symbols like stars and slashes, and in the margins short notes as cold as verdicts. Not good. Cut hours. Talks too much. Let go. Send back to the agency. Jade pointed to her own name. to a block of hours reduced in a way that made no sense even though she remembered working late that day, then pointed to an older man in the glass wash area, whose hours had been slashed right after he'd asked for time off to see a doctor. And Kayla felt something tighten in her chest, not because she was surprised, but because the cruelty here was written in ink, neat, and legalized. Kayla took out her phone, turned on silent capture, and photographed every page with edits, every line with revenge in the margins, then pulled a thin, stapled folder toward her. On top was a weekly tip summary, columns of numbers that should have matched the pause reports. But here there were strange gaps, deductions with no reason, and a handwritten line that said, "held back for management." Kayla photographed it, then looked at Jade and saw her biting her lip until it went white, like she was afraid she'd just committed a crime with no return. Kayla whispered that this wasn't a crime, it was evidence, and she kept going, opening a second cabinet drawer where vendor invoices for the gala were stored. Thick paper, elegant headers, signatures, stamps, everything looking as legitimate as a prayer. But as soon as Kayla flipped through a few sheets, she saw contract numbers that didn't match. There were invoices listing fresh flowers and cold transport services, but the total was broken into multiple smaller charges, like someone was trying to stay under a control threshold. And tucked inside was a delivery schedule. No logo, only times, and coded labels. Several deliveries were marked to enter through the Western service door, at the exact shift change window, the kind of scheduling nobody ordinary needed, and Kayla saw a string of characters repeated beside a few vendor names, looking more like a cipher than a logistics note. When she cross-checked quickly against the official invoices, she realized some deliveries didn't appear anywhere on legitimate payment paperwork. Jade swallowed hard and said she'd seen crates with no company name, only plain tape and marker scrawls, delivery men without uniforms, and yet security still let them in like they'd been told in advance. And afterward, Cynthia would come into this room alone and lock the door for a long time. Kayla photographed the entire delivery schedule, photographed the invoices with the odd patterns, then lifted a small notebook from beneath a stack of papers. The first page was printed with payroll adjustments, but inside it wasn't only payroll. There was a list of abbreviated names, numbers repeating in cycles, and a few notes about Gala logistics. Kayla didn't read it all. She only took photos fast, because she heard a cart rolling in the hallway outside. Low voices, and that sound made her heart hammer harder. Not because she was afraid of being caught, but because she understood she'd just touched a deeper layer of evil. A layer that wasn't only skimming tips, but using elegant events as a mask for dirty money. Jade whispered, asking Kayla what they were getting pulled into, and Kayla didn't answer right away. She only drew Jade closer to the door, pressed an ear to listen, then turned her phone screen off and slid it back into her pocket, because she knew from this moment on, the photos on her device weren't just leverage against Cynthia, they could be the reason someone wanted her to disappear. Kayla looked at Jade, her voice low and steady, and said they were going to leave this room as if they'd never entered it. They were going to stay calm the way you stayed alive. And when she stepped out, Kayla rebolted the door with the careful hands of someone who'd just taken hold of a piece of truth sharp enough to cut both ways, because she understood that if Margot was setting a chessboard upstairs and Grant was calculating downstairs, then what Kayla had photographed in this cold room was the card everyone would want ripped out of her hands. They'd barely left the payroll log room when Jade was still trembling like someone who'd just walked out of a room that held a storm. Kayla stayed beside her, keeping an ordinary pace like camouflage, but every nerve in her body was stretched tight by the feeling of being watched from behind. And when they turned into the corridor that led to the freight elevator, the fluorescent light suddenly flickered once like a bad wink. The compressor in the corner of the wall exhaled a long hiss, and the freight elevator door ahead slid open as if someone had been waiting for them. An unfamiliar security guard stood by the control panel, wearing none of the hotel's social smile, his eyes lingering on Jade one beat too long. And Kayla understood at once this wasn't coincidence. This was what Margot called a clean warning, a threat just sharp enough to make poor people fold in on themselves. Jade tried to slip past, but he stepped in front of her and said there was cargo that needed moving. Asked Jade to help push the cart into the elevator, his voice light, polite, but his hand already set on the edge of the door like a lock. Kayla moved to pull Jade back, but Jade had seen the metal cart stacked with heavy crates, and the worker reflex in her, the reflex of someone terrified of getting her name written down, kicked in, so she stepped forward. And the moment the wheels touched the elevator floor, a dry clack snapped through the air like a bone breaking, The door slid shut faster than normal, catching at a thin gap, and Kayla heard metal grinding like someone was forcing the closing mechanism on purpose. Jade panicked and slammed at the buttons. The elevator shuddered and dropped half a level like a misstep. The lights inside stuttered. Jade's breath choked into a broken cry, and Kayla's body went cold because she understood an accident at the right moment was the easiest way to make someone permanently silent. Kayla lunged to pry the doors, but the lock held, and the guard stood outside, watching as if he were following procedure. His eyes not afraid, only carrying the impatient edge of someone who wanted the job finished. Then, behind Kayla, a shadow moved without sound. Grant appeared at the corner of the hallway, as if he'd always been closer than people assumed. He didn't ask questions, didn't raise his voice. He only looked at the control panel, looked at the guard's hand, and said one short line that bent the air in half. "Open it, right now." The guard tried to argue that the system was malfunctioning, that it was automatic, that it wasn't safe. But Miles was there from nowhere, standing slightly off to the side like a pin in a hinge, and another hotel guard stepped in at Grant's glance, without needing a second command. Grant bent, placed his hand on the elevator door edge, as if testing its stiffness, then turned to the unfamiliar guard, his voice low and even, and asked who he was working for, and the question wasn't meant to receive an answer. It was meant to measure a reflex, and the man's reflex was a quick glance down at the radio on his shoulder, like he was searching for rescue. And that glance alone was enough. Grant didn't punch, didn't slap, didn't do anything loud. He stepped in close, hooked 2 fingers around the radio cord, yanked it free with a clean motion, then pressed the man into the wall with just enough force to keep him from taking a deep breath. And in a single beat, the man's expression shifted from defiant to frightened, because he realized this wasn't hotel management. This was power ordinary rules couldn't touch. Grant tilted his head and spoke so softly nobody but that man could hear. Yet Kayla watched the color drain from the man's face like a secret being ripped open. Then Grant let him go, signaled for his people to hold him, while Miles crouched at the control panel, popped the technical cover with a small tool like he'd come prepared. And after a few quick movements, the elevator doors finally sprang open. Jade nearly collapsed when the car stopped. Kayla grabbed her hand and pulled her out, saw scraped skin at Jade's wrist, saw her face pale as paper, her eyes too wide from having death brush past close enough to feel the wind of it. Grant didn't hug anyone, didn't soothe anyone. He tossed Kayla a clean towel, ordered Jade taken to internal medical, ordered his people to check the entire freight elevator line, his tone calm like he was dealing with a water leak, and that calmness was what made Kayla truly shake. Because it wasn't indifference, it was habit. Kayla looked at Grant, and, for the first time, she saw the distance between the man she called her husband and the world he belonged to. A world where violence didn't need gunfire or a stage. It lived in how he measured a glance, how he cut a line of communication, how he controlled a body with exactly the amount of force required to end something cleanly. And Kayla understood the offices, the charities, the expensive suits were only the surface, and beneath them was a system that ran on fear and precision, where an accident could be ordered the way someone ordered a drink. Jade gasped for air, clinging to Kayla's hand like a plank in fast water, and Kayla pulled her close, shielding and holding her at once, while Grant turned away quickly to speak with Miles, and Kayla heard in his voice a word he didn't say but the entire hallway understood. That from this moment on, this wasn't a hotel matter anymore. This was war beneath the carpet. Jade was taken by Grant's people toward the internal medical room, her steps still off rhythm, as if the freight elevator's slip was still vibrating inside her bones. Kayla followed for a few paces. Then Miles stopped her with a slight tilt of his head. Not rough, but final. As if reminding her that right now, she shouldn't be too close to any hot point. Grant had turned down another route to speak with his team, and Kayla remained in the middle of a crossing hallway, where high-hanging signs pointed toward service and the linen storage. It wasn't under the ballroom's authority, but it wasn't fully the kitchen's either. A neutral strip, cold as a hospital corridor, where anything could be overheard, and nobody would be labeled an eavesdropper. She'd just opened her phone to call the clinic back about Jonah, when a figure stepped out from a blind corner as if she'd been waiting. She wasn't in a hotel uniform, and she didn't carry the posture of someone sneaking. She was simply a middle-aged woman with her hair pinned into a neat bun, a dark coat, eyes sharp and awake as needles, blocking Kayla just enough that Kayla couldn't walk past, but without pressing her against the wall. Her voice was low, level, with no extra words. Kayla Maddox, right. And the way she spoke Kayla's name sounded like Cynthia had, but different, because there was no contempt in it. There was the certainty of someone who'd read a file. Kayla tightened her grip on the phone, instinct telling her to step back. But the woman lifted a hand and flashed an ID badge just long enough for Kayla to catch the word federal before it vanished again. Then she introduced herself as Simone Park and said this wasn't a conversation for the hotel to hear, and it wasn't for Kayla's husband to hear either, at least not yet. Kayla heard the word husband, and her heart struck heavy, because if this woman could call Grant her husband, that meant they knew, and not only a name, but the structure underneath it. Park studied Kayla the way you studied someone standing at a cliff edge, and said they were investigating a money laundering and organized crime network using the high-end hospitality industry. Charity events, vendor contracts, deliveries through service doors, split invoices, those were familiar fingerprints, and the Castellane was only one link in a long chain they'd tracked long enough to know nothing here was accidental. Kayla didn't answer right away. She tried to keep her face from giving anything away, but Park had already seen the shift in her eyes when the deliveries were mentioned. Park continued, saying Kayla had just been inside the payroll log room. Right. Cold ran straight down Kayla's spine, because that should have been known only to her and Jade. But in America, cameras and data always sided with whoever had access. Kayla said if Park was here to threaten her, she'd pick the wrong person. Kayla wasn't here to play spy games. She was here because people were stealing wages, and because her little brother needed treatment. Park didn't smile. She only nodded once, very slightly, and said she believed her, because people usually didn't take risks on a night like this, unless they were backed against the wall. Then Park said plainly that what had just happened to Jade wasn't an accident, and if Kayla kept holding evidence without protection around it, the next accident wouldn't end at a scrape. Kayla listened, and suddenly the truth seemed to have a smell. The smell of this corridor, cold air and metal. The smell of power that didn't need armor to make people shrink. She looked Park straight on and said, if Park wanted her to be an informant, she should forget it. Kayla didn't want Jonah growing up inside fear, and she didn't want Jade turned into bait in a war between powerful men. Park answered that she didn't need a pawn. She needed someone who knew how to say no, because people who knew how to say no often survived longer in cases like this. But she didn't sugarcoat it. She said the truth had a price, and that price was usually paid in blood or prison, and Kayla would have to choose how to pay. Kayla said she had one condition. Jonah and Jade had to be safe. Not the kind of safety written on paper while they were left to scramble, but real safety, monitored, sheltered, with medical access that couldn't be cut, and Jade not dragged into questioning like a criminal simply for doing the right thing. Park watched Kayla for a few seconds, weighing her like a heavy object, then said she could trigger conditional protection for Jonah and Jade if Kayla turned over evidence of labor fraud and vendor irregularities through a closed channel. In exchange, Kayla wasn't to speak about this with anyone except her lawyer, and she wasn't to interfere with what Park was already tracking. Park would give her a one-time phone number and a handoff point for transferring data, but she would only promise within the boundaries of the case. She wouldn't promise to protect Kayla from her Mafia husband if he decided Kayla was a risk. The last line slid across Kayla like a blade. She swallowed hard, because Park had just named the thing Kayla still couldn't bring herself to call. Kayla asked, "Do you think Grant is Mafia?" Park didn't answer directly. She only said that in New York there were people who owned an entire city in silence. And if Kayla was living beside someone like that and still didn't know, then either he was very good at protecting her, or he was very good at lying, and both were dangerous in their own way. Kayla squeezed her phone until her fingers went numb. She looked toward the end of the corridor where Grant had disappeared, feeling the urge to run toward him and to run far away at the same time. Then she turned back to Park and said she wouldn't hand over anything that left Jade and Jonah abandoned. Park replied that was why she was standing here, and she had only one sentence left before she walked away, that if Kayla wanted to live, she should keep everything tight. She shouldn't trust the smiles upstairs, and she shouldn't think the man beside her was the only one playing this game. Park stepped back once and vanished into the flow of staff movement as if she'd never existed, leaving Kayla alone with her phone in her hand and a deal as narrow as a blade, sharp enough to cut a rope, sharp enough to draw blood. Kayla had barely managed to draw a breath to keep herself from shaking when Miles appeared at the end of the hallway like a period placed at the end of any random conversation. He didn't ask who she'd just met. He only said quietly that Grant wanted to see her now, then guided her through private stair doors that opened only with a keycard, up to a level the gala music couldn't reach, where thick carpet swallowed footsteps and the lighting turned a warm yellow that felt manufactured, like a room designed to make people forget there was a storm outside. Grant's suite sat behind a dark wooden door. Inside, it was clean to the point of cold, the faint scent of wood and men's cologne in the air, windows looking down at Midtown like a painting of lights that never slept, and the stillness itself made Kayla feel her heart pounding harder, as if silence were a new kind of torture. Grant stood beside a bar that hadn't been opened, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up, tendons visible at his wrist like steel wire. He didn't turn right away. He only said Jade was safe, and someone was taking her to be checked. Then he looked at Kayla, and his eyes were still cold, but not the cold of the ballroom. It was the cold of a man trying to control the instinct to shield by using discipline. Kayla didn't sit. She stayed standing at a distance, just far enough that his scent couldn't pull her back. Her voice was low and clipped as she asked directly about the sealed file with her name at the Castellane. Asked why his mother looked at her like she already knew her. Asked how people could speak her name like they were reading an index. And most of all asked what he'd been hiding inside this marriage. Grant didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window for a beat, as if weighing which would kill her faster, truth or the lack of it. Then he said there were things that were safer the fewer people knew them, and he'd done it to protect her. Kayla let out a dry laugh. Not because it was funny, but because that was what people always said, right before they made you blind inside your own life. She said protection didn't include the right to keep her in the dark, and if he wanted her to keep standing beside him, he had to accept one simple thing. She needed enforceable boundaries, not promises. Grant stepped closer by one pace, but Kayla lifted her hand and stopped him the way you stopped a wave. She stated each condition clearly, like reading a contract she'd written with medical bills and sleepless nights in Queens. She needed a separate account in her own name, money that was hers. Nobody allowed to control it or trace it in a way that could tie her down. She needed a written document confirming her right to leave at any time. No conditions, no retaliation, no using Jonah or Jade as leverage. And she needed medical security for Jonah. Follow-up appointments, medications, deposits, everything handled as a specific commitment instead of a favor. Grant listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change much, but Kayla saw something strange, as if he wasn't surprised, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for a long time, and that chilled her more than the silence, because it proved he'd prepared for the day she found out and still chose not to speak. Miles set a stack of papers on the low table near the sofa, thin but heavy as stone. There was no ornate title, only pages already drafted with blanks for signatures, clauses about a separate account, about the right to leave, about medical support and confidentiality. Kayla saw an entire structure built in advance, like an exit route calculated for her from the day he married her, and she couldn't tell if that was tenderness or manipulation. Kayla looked at Grant and asked him who he was. Really? Grant only said he was a man with enemies, and if she spoke the right name, that name would drag more darkness to her front door. He said he didn't love her in the language of poetry. He loved her in the language of risk, so he wouldn't spill everything in one night while hotel hallways were still full of ears. But he would give her the right to choose to stay or leave through paperwork, not tears. Kayla swallowed against dryness. She wanted to tear the vague sentences apart, but she also knew Jonah was waiting. Jade had almost been killed by an accident placed on a schedule, and in this world paperwork could be the only armor the weak ever got. She took the pen, didn't rush to sign, read every line, hunted for loopholes the way she hunted for a crack in a door. Miles stood still, waiting. Grant stood still too, and their patience made Kayla realize this was what they did best, waiting for the exact moment when everything fell into the right place. In the end, Kayla signed the pages tied to the account, and Jonah's medical care first, her eyes never leaving Grant. Then she said this was only the beginning. She wouldn't be a protected doll. She wouldn't stay silent just to be safe. And if he wanted to keep her in his life, he had to learn to tell the truth piece by piece, because truth buried in silence always grew teeth. Grant gave a small nod, like accepting a new law, but he didn't hold her. He only said the night wasn't over, and Kayla understood, in her own cold way, that when a man like Grant said it wasn't over, it meant everything had only just begun. When Kayla stepped out of the suite, her palm still held the sensation of the pen she'd just used, like she'd signed not only paper but the boundary of her own life. Miles walked ahead to open the private stair door. Grant didn't stay tight beside her. He kept a half-beat of distance, as if intentionally giving her room to breathe. And that space, instead of soothing her, made the truth between them feel even clearer, like a thick pane of glass, transparent but untouchable. They went back down toward the area near the ballroom, where the jazz returned smooth as if nobody had almost died in a freight elevator, where the lighting was still beautiful enough to be a lie. And the moment Kayla stepped into the corridor that fed into the gala floor, she felt eyes turn toward her like compass needles meeting a magnetic field. Not because she was dressed to stand out, but because someone had already turned her into a story before she'd even opened her mouth. Brielle Lang stood near the bar with a cluster of donors and a few mid-level hotel managers. She smiled just enough, her voice tuned to the exact frequency that made people lean in. And Kayla caught fragments falling like glass shards. A temporary worker who was unstable, someone who staged a scene to demand money, cheap blackmail, someone even saying she'd stolen something in the back and been caught red-handed. Brielle saw Kayla and her eyes brightened, not with surprise, but with opportunity, like someone who'd prepared the second act and was only waiting for the actor to step onto the stage. She walked over, the click of her heels on stone like the tapping of a small hammer. Then she spoke loudly enough for the nearby circle to hear. "Kayla, right. Do you want to give back what you took, or do you want me to call hotel security and make this a bigger problem?" Kayla looked straight at Brielle and saw a few people behind her holding their phones low, as if they were only texting. But Kayla knew that was how people filmed, hunting for the moment a poor girl cracked in public. If she screamed, they'd have proof she was unstable. If she cried, they'd have proof she was playing victim. Kayla kept her face flat as water and said lightly that she didn't know what Brielle was talking about, and if Brielle had a specific accusation, she should state it clearly right here, in her own words, so everyone could hear. Brielle paused, just a fraction, because a cornered person was supposed to react with emotion, but Kayla was reacting with a demand for clarity, and Brielle recovered quickly. She smiled and said Kayla had slipped into a restricted area, had tried to access internal files, had tried to take information to pressure the hotel and demand hush money, and that she had witnesses. She even said Kayla had threatened to create a scandal if she wasn't paid. Her voice was honey-sweet, but every word carried a hook. Kayla didn't argue in a higher tone. She only asked again, "You're saying I tried to take information. What information? And I demanded money from who? From you or from the hotel? Say it clearly." Brielle moved closer, trying to drag Kayla into the dark corner of emotion, and whispered that she knew Kayla's type, knew the people who came out of Queens with bills and cheap dreams, that Kayla should know her place, and if Kayla wanted peace, she should apologize and disappear. Kayla heard Queens like a slap, but she didn't let it rise into tears. She gave a small nod, like she was taking notes, then turned her head and scanned the room for the right faces. An HR manager near the check-in table, a service shift lead holding a clipboard, and a hotel security guard she'd seen beside Cynthia earlier. Kayla knew everyone in this building feared Grant, but they also feared paperwork, and they feared having their names dragged into a lawsuit. Kayla told Brielle, still loud enough for the nearby group to hear, that she wanted Brielle to repeat the accusation in front of HR and hotel security, because if Brielle truly believed Kayla had stolen or blackmailed, then Brielle should file an incident report immediately, not scatter rumors at the bar. Brielle gave a thin smile and said Kayla was trying to deflect, that Kayla was performing, and Kayla answered that no, she only wanted proper procedure, and she wanted Brielle to repeat exactly what she'd just said, that Kayla had slipped into a restricted area to take internal information and use it for blackmail, because that was a serious allegation, and Kayla wouldn't accept being smeared by whispers. Brielle noticed a few people leaning in, a few people flipping into drama mode, and she assumed Kayla was digging her own grave, so she repeated it, this time clearer, adding that Kayla had threatened to disrupt the gala if she wasn't paid, and that she had the right to throw Kayla out immediately. Kayla heard enough, then very calmly took out her phone, not holding it up, only waking the lock screen to show the time, tapping once to send the photos and notes she'd taken in the payroll log room into a secure folder she'd prepared in advance, then slipping the phone back into her pocket as if she'd done nothing. She looked at Brielle, her voice still quiet but sharp, and said thank you for repeating that in front of HR and security, because now the responsible parties had heard a specific allegation, not gossip, and that allegation would have to come with evidence, or it would become a legal problem for Brielle and for the hotel. Brielle's face tightened, as she realized Kayla wasn't exploding the way she wanted. Kayla wasn't begging, wasn't pleading, wasn't giving Brielle the clip of a poor girl losing control. Instead, Kayla was building a trap out of calm, forcing Brielle to repeat a lie in front of the right people, in the right place. And when Brielle was still searching for a way to change the rhythm, Kayla tilted her head and asked one last question like a stamp. Was Brielle willing to sign a written report of that accusation right now? Or did she only dare to say it when she believed nobody was recording it through proper procedure? The question didn't blow up the room, but it shifted the eyes around them from amusement to caution, because in New York, people could laugh at someone else's humiliation, but they went quiet the moment they heard the word lawsuit. The air around the bar had changed its smell. It wasn't champagne and perfume anymore. It was the scent of trouble about to be dragged into the light. A few people began to step back by half a pace like they were afraid of getting splashed. HR and hotel security moved closer on instinct, the way people did when their job was to stand between two crowds. Brielle kept her smile, but the corners of her mouth were tight now because she'd realized Kayla wasn't prey that tore easily. And just as Brielle was about to pivot the story in a new direction, the ring of bodies parted as if an invisible force pushed them aside. Grant Vascari had appeared at the edge of the hall with the calm posture of someone who didn't need to ask for space, because space opened for him. He didn't hurry. He didn't raise his voice. He walked straight toward the argument the way he'd walk toward a contract signing table. Grant's gaze swept over Brielle, over HR, over security, then landed on Kayla for a beat long enough for her to know he'd heard. And then he turned to the hotel operations manager and said in a low, clipped tone that from this moment, the Castellane's payroll system and tip reporting were frozen. Nobody was to edit. Nobody was to enter new data. Nobody was to access anything except an independent audit group designated by Miles. And he wanted a third-party team brought in tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Not next week. Right now. The manager opened his mouth to talk about procedure, business hours, needing board approval, but Grant cut him off with a simple sentence, that if he wanted to keep his chair, he'd do it. The voice carried no theatrical threat, only a certainty that made everyone understand pushing back right now was career suicide. Grant turned to the head of security and ordered every piece of footage from the back of house, the service corridors, the freight elevator, the payroll log room, and any related camera sealed at once. No deletions, no overwrites, no edits. He wanted the access list and system logs immediately. Then he looked at HR and ordered them to call Cynthia to the ballroom and suspend her keycard access on the spot. Cynthia's name hit the air like a glass dropped onto stone. A few people jolted. A few immediately glanced at each other. Brielle went rigid because she understood the game was being pulled out of her hands, away from microphones and rumor, dragged into the territory of paperwork and consequences. Within minutes, Cynthia was brought out like someone yanked from a hiding place, her face pale but still trying to stay hard. She looked at Kayla like she wanted to kill with her eyes, then looked at Grant as if seeking protection through power, but Grant gave her no opening. He said Cynthia was suspended immediately for violating procedure and unlawfully interfering with HR data. Her access badge would be confiscated. All communication with the staffing agency would be handled by legal counsel, and if Cynthia had anything to say, she could say it to a lawyer, not here. Cynthia blurted that this was a misunderstanding, that Kayla was a troublemaker, that Brielle could confirm it, but Grant didn't look at Brielle. He stared straight at Cynthia and said he didn't need stories. He needed logs and evidence, and in that moment, the entire ballroom understood that Grant's power wasn't in the fact that he could make people afraid. It was in the way he could turn fear into procedure, and procedure into lawful punishment, clean enough that nobody dared touch it. A few people started clapping out of habit, the reflex of a crowd when they saw a performance of leadership. But the applause died quickly when Kayla stepped forward by half a step, not standing beside Grant like an accessory, not leaning into him to be sheltered. She stood slightly off to the side, far enough for everyone to see she didn't belong to him like property. Kayla looked at the elegant faces, watching with curiosity, and she didn't offer a long explanation. She said plainly what they always tried not to hear, that some people working here lived hour to hour, tip to tip, that a cut shift could mean rent didn't get paid, that a withheld tip could be milk money, daycare money, medication money, and she spoke about Jade without laying out every detail, only saying someone had nearly been hurt tonight near the freight elevator by something that looked like an accident, and things like that only grew when a system allowed the strong to crush the weak without being seen. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't play the victim. She spoke like someone who'd lived long enough to understand silence was complicity, and that calm voice made the room more uncomfortable than any scream ever could, because it forced them to face the backstage of the party they were enjoying. Grant didn't steal the microphone. He let Kayla speak, and his silence this time wasn't calculation in the dark. It felt like a cold acknowledgement that she had the right to name the pain, and all he could guarantee was that the pain would be recorded, audited, processed. Brielle stood nearby, her smile completely gone now, her eyes flicking fast as she searched for an exit. And Margot, far away, still wore her perfect face, but Kayla could feel the cold of her spreading through the air like a quiet promise that the chess game wasn't over just because an audit had begun. The audit team being called in that same night made the ballroom feel like an invisible hand had tightened around its throat. The music kept running, but people laughed more softly. Toasts slid into whispers, and Kayla felt like she was standing on a glossy surface that had just cracked, where one wrong step could send the fracture spreading. Grant spoke a few short sentences to Miles, then signaled for Kayla to move away from the densest crowd. Not because he was afraid of scandal, but because he understood that people who hunted for weakness would pounce the moment the room was rattled. Kayla didn't argue. She only texted Jade to ask how she was, and the reply came faster than Kayla expected. Jade said she was near the internal medical room, but had been told to go back and help with something in back of house. And even in text, the words seemed to tremble, like she didn't want to return to the corridors where the freight elevator had almost swallowed her. Kayla had barely finished reading when a coordinator hurried over and said quietly there was an issue downstairs. They needed someone connected to payroll and HR to confirm a few things. The request sounded reasonable, the right kind of procedural language, but Kayla felt the back of her neck go cold, because procedure was the easiest mask for dragging someone into a hidden place. She looked toward Grant, but he was being held in conversation by a knot of managers and someone from the audit unit that had just arrived. And in that beat, Kayla understood that tonight didn't have only one stage, there were stages under the floor. She decided to go herself, not because she wanted to be reckless, but because Jade was down there. And if Jade got pulled into another trap, then every piece of evidence Kayla held would stop meaning anything. Miles started to follow, but Grant stopped him with a look, as if ordering Miles to hold the upstairs line. Then Grant looked at Kayla and said short that she was to go with one of his guards. Kayla nodded, didn't thank him, just moved. They went down through the service stairs, and the deeper they went, the more the jazz dissolved into a dull hum, replaced by machine noise, water moving through pipes, damp air and metal, and Kayla noticed the gray-painted door Cynthia had once blocked was now ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it, as if a service route had been left open at the exact moment everyone upstairs was distracted by the audit. The guard with Kayla hesitated, his eyes sweeping fast, but before he could signal retreat, a linen cart rolled across the far end of the corridor. The person pushing it wore a low baseball cap and no hotel uniform, the wheels whispering like they'd been greased. And behind the cart was an unlabeled crate wrapped in black film, exactly the kind Jade had described. Kayla held her breath and understood this wasn't hotel staff. This was someone else's people. The guard touched his earpiece, but the signal stuttered, as if someone was jamming it, or as if the basement had dead zones. And right then, another man stepped out of the shadows. No obvious gun in his hand, only a stack of papers and a phone, his voice calm like a delivery worker as he said, they had authorization to enter the service area under the Gala vendor list. Everything was legitimate, and if the guard made it difficult, there would be trouble. Kayla watched how he stood, how he didn't rush, how he knew the exact words to threaten while still wearing the costume of legality, and she understood their goal wasn't a loud shooting. Their goal was to create a situation ugly enough to blame on someone else, sudden enough for the press to bite, and accidental enough for a weak person to disappear without anyone taking responsibility. Jade appeared at the far end of the opposite corridor, her face paper white. Clearly someone had summoned her down, and when Jade's eyes met Kayla's, Kayla saw panic flare like fuel catching flame. Jade started to move toward Kayla, but the man with the papers lifted a hand to block her and said she needed to sign a delivery confirmation. Just a few words. Sign and she could go, and Kayla heard how soft his voice was. Soft in a way that was terrifying, like coaxing a child to the edge of a cliff. Kayla stepped forward and told Jade to back up, and in that exact moment, one of the crates on the cart was nudged sideways like an accident, dropped onto the floor with a loud crack, the black wrap tearing at one corner to reveal glass bottles, clear liquid inside. and a harsh chemical smell rising fast, strong enough that someone later could say there had been a hazardous incident. Prohibited material, a safety violation, a reason to lock the area down and assign blame. Grant's guard reached to pull Kayla back, but another man slipped in, his hand stretching toward Jade's wrist, not yanking hard, only enough to startle her, and Kayla lunged on instinct, grabbed Jade's hand and hauled her toward herself like pulling a child out of traffic. In that second, Kayla saw the most horrifying part wasn't the crates or the chemical stench. It was the preparation, the service route open at the right moment, the gray door ajar at the right moment, the radio signal failing at the right moment, and Jade being called down at the right moment, all of it fitting together into a picture of design. Kayla thought of Margot, thought of the anonymous call Margot could have made, thought of the way Margot had spoken about a precise window of time, and a cold voice inside Kayla said this wasn't coincidence. It was a deliberate shove meant to scare her, to silence Jade, to drag Grant into a stain that would be hard to wash off. Kayla tightened her grip on Jade, her eyes scanning fast for an exit, and just as she was about to shout for Grant, a man on the opposite side stepped in and covered Jade's mouth with a gloved hand, not crushing her, only enough to stop her from screaming, enough to make the scene look like chaotic jostling, and in his eyes there was no anger, only task, as if Jade were just an obstacle to clear. Grant's guard surged forward, but another attacker checked him with a precise shoulder hit, not a punch, just enough to throw his balance, and in that beat of chaos, Kayla understood the basement had been breached by a team that hadn't come to kill outright. They had come to manufacture an accident where someone died or got hurt, and that someone was never going to be them. Kayla kept Jade tight against her body and tried to pull her toward the stair door, while footsteps farther down began to gather like hunting dogs. And Kayla knew that tonight, beneath the Castellane's luxurious carpet, a door had been opened not for service, but for war. The chaos in the basement hadn't even had time to bloom into a public disaster before it was cut short, clean, like a rope severed at the exact right point. Kayla had just dragged Jade back toward the service stair door when a low voice sounded behind her, not loud, but piercing through every other noise like a needle. Stop. That single word was enough to make the men closing in hesitate for half a beat, like hunting dogs recognizing the crack of a familiar whip. Grant appeared at the mouth of the dark corridor. No jacket, no showmanship, only Miles half a step behind him, and two other men Kayla had never seen with the hotel. Their posture didn't read like security. It read like men who knew how to place their bodies where bullets went, even on a night when nobody wanted a gunshot. Grant's eyes flicked to the crate where the black wrap had torn, flicked to the gloved hand covering Jade's mouth, then locked on the man holding the stack of papers the way you looked at a number on a ledger. He didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. He only gave one sentence that sounded like a work instruction. Take them out. Clean. And instantly the two men with him split off. They didn't rush like a movie. They moved by angles, pressed the nearest man into the wall with just enough force to steal his breath without making a big sound, one hand locking the wrist, the other ripping the radio off his shirt, cutting communication, like cutting the oxygen of a story. The one covering Jade's mouth tried to drag her toward a blind corner, but Grant's men were already there first. A low knee block, a shoulder pin, and in a blink, Jade was pulled free of the gloved hand. Kayla wrapped her arms around Jade and felt the girl shaking all over like she'd just been hauled out of icy water. And under the basement's sick white light, Kayla saw this wasn't a rescue team. This was a cleanup team. There were no gunshots, no blood spraying, and yet there was violence. Violence used like a tool. Tight, precise, stripped of extra emotion, like a surgeon cutting out infection before it spread. And Kayla knew by instinct that you didn't learn this kind of violence in a gym or an office. You learned it in places where police didn't arrive in time. The man with the papers tried to retreat, his mouth still running about authorization, vendor lists, rights to access the service area, clinging to the last layer of legality like a coat in winter. But Miles stepped in, pinched the stack of papers from his hand, flipped one page fast, then looked up, and that single look was enough to settle Grant's decision. Grant gave a small nod, no extra words needed, and his men pulled the man into a side corridor. Out of the hotel cameras Kayla knew had dead zones, and Kayla shivered as she realized everything in this building had a second map. A map not hung on walls, a map held by people like Grant. Another man tried to make it bigger by tipping the crate to spread more chemical smell and more chaos, but Grant stepped in, laid a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that almost looked friendly, then said very softly, "Don't." And the way the man went still, like all the blood had drained out of him, told Kayla more than any confession could, because nobody froze like that in front of someone who was only a hotel donor. Kayla looked into Grant's eyes and, for the first time, she saw not only wealth and power, but power with history. Power that had been used and had won, the kind of power that made people afraid just hearing the name. Grant turned back to Kayla, his gaze sweeping over her fast to check for injuries like an ingrained habit. Then he looked at Jade and spoke in orders, not questions. "Get them upstairs. Now." Kayla wanted to protest, wanted to ask what he was going to do with the men he'd taken, but Grant gave her no answer. "Not here," he said, and it wasn't vague anymore. It was law. They moved without running. Running was panic, and panic was loss of control. Grant stayed behind Kayla and Jade like a walking wall, one of his men going ahead to clear the path. Miles beside them with his phone in his hand, sending short commands that needed no explanation. Kayla caught fragments: West Line, lock doors, clean it up, and she understood the fight was being managed so that the ballroom above could keep believing everything was only a back-of-house malfunction. When they reached the hallway level near the suite, Jade suddenly broke into soundless sobbing, tears falling while her throat couldn't form a cry. Kayla held her, feeling like she'd just pulled someone out of a beast's mouth, and Grant stood a few steps away, not touching them, but not leaving either, like he was guarding an invisible door. Kayla looked at him and asked in a hoarse voice who he really was, and this time Grant didn't dodge. He only gave one short, cutting sentence. "Someone wants to turn you into news, and turn Jade into an accident, so tonight I'm not going to argue definitions. I'm getting you out of this building first." Kayla heard "getting you out" and understood he was choosing them over optics. Because if Grant wanted to stay clean in front of the crowd, he could have let the hotel handle it, let internal security file reports, let the media be diverted, but instead he'd come down into the basement, used his own team, pulled them out of a trap, and that act put a crack across his cold face. Not the crack of softness, but the crack of a principle. Kayla didn't doubt anymore. She knew her husband was a Mafia boss the way you knew fire was hot once it burned you. And at the same time, the thing that frightened her most wasn't the truth itself, but the fact that in the most dangerous moment, he'd chosen to protect her and Jade before he chose to protect his own reputation, as if under the ice of a ruthless man, there was a strange discipline holding him back from becoming a complete monster. Kayla had a chance to run the moment she understood the truth, the moment she watched Grant's men handle a threat the way you handled a system error. But she didn't run, not because she believed in a fairy tale, but because she understood that running in the dark only made her a target that was easier to hunt, and because Jonah was in Queens, trapped between appointment schedules and medical bills the way a body lay between two blades, and she couldn't abandon her brother just to save herself on instinct. Grant brought Kayla and Jade into a small room off a secondary suite, discreet, with a locking door, and someone posted outside. Jade was given water, her scrapes were checked, and she was steadied by the quiet presence of people who knew how not to make fear erupt into something bigger. Kayla sat straight on the edge of a chair like she was sitting at a courthouse table, her eyes never leaving Grant, and in that air the question wasn't whether he was dangerous. The question was how she would live beside danger without letting it swallow her. Miles set a laptop on the table and opened a document template that was already framed, but this time, it wasn't only a separate account and medical support. Kayla demanded more. She said clearly that she needed a shield made of paperwork, not to challenge Grant, but to make sure that if she had to leave, she could leave intact. And if she stayed with autonomy, not inside a gilded cage. Miles typed fast, his voice steady as a machine as he read back each clause for Kayla to confirm. An unconditional right to leave document effective immediately, paired with a non-retaliation clause, direct or indirect. No surveillance, no interference with her residence, no pressure through a landlord, an employer, or an agency, and if violated, it would trigger a legal structure held by an independent law firm. Kayla demanded an additional protection plan for Jonah, including health insurance activated immediately, follow-up appointments scheduled, medications not interrupted, and most importantly, that Jonah would not be pulled into Grant's world, would not be used as leverage, would not become a name spoken in midnight conversations. Miles recorded it, and Kayla felt her hands stop trembling as she watched those words appear on the screen, because words were the only thing she could hold in a world where guns could show up without anyone calling the police. She demanded a clear separation of her assets and her decisions. The separate account was one part, but she also needed explicit confirmation that any income she earned, any support meant for Jonah, any medical expense, any job choice and housing choice she made would be hers to decide. No permission required, not asking, not owing, and any asset Grant transferred to her had to be recorded as a non-revocable gift with no attached conditions. Grant listened without cutting in, without arguing, and that made Kayla feel lighter and colder at the same time, because the ease with which he accepted everything sounded like he'd already prepared for it, as if he understood exactly what he could take, and exactly what he had to swear never to take. Kayla looked at Grant and asked if he had a problem with her building walls. Grant said clear walls were better than darkness, and he added one sentence that made Kayla's throat tighten, that he'd rather she have a clean exit door than have to break a door down with blood when fear finally won everything. Miles printed the documents on a small printer someone brought in, the paper feeding out like steady rain. Kayla read every page again, tightened a few phrases, demanded one more sentence that any communication involving Jonah had to go through her only, and demanded an additional appendix naming a medical proxy in case she couldn't be reached. Kayla chose someone outside Grant's circle, an independent doctor or lawyer, and Miles nodded and typed it in like he understood the rule. When everything was ready, Kayla set the pen down in front of Grant, didn't say please, didn't say thank you, only said sign it, and the room seemed to freeze, because if Grant refused, everything would collapse. And if Grant signed, he would be admitting she didn't belong to him in the sense of ownership. Grant picked up the pen and signed immediately. No questions, no negotiation, his signature decisive like a cut. And for the first time, Kayla saw a real line appear between protection and possession, not a line she invented to comfort herself, but a line confirmed by ink and paper. Kayla held her copy in her hands, feeling the thin page weigh more than any jewelry, heavier than any promise, because it told her she could stay without being imprisoned, and if she ever had to leave, she didn't need permission. She didn't need to vanish like someone being hunted. She had the right to walk out through the front door of her own life. Grant looked at Kayla, his eyes still cold but no longer the cold of power trying to keep. It was the cold of a man who'd just accepted that love sometimes meant handing over the key instead of locking the door. And Kayla realized she was still afraid of him. But this time, her fear had a shape, and when fear had a shape, she could draw boundaries around it instead of letting it consume her. Kayla slid the paper copy into her bag like she was stowing a piece of armor, then stepped out of the room with a new kind of calm. Not the calm of someone who believed everything would be fine, but the calm of someone who'd just drawn a line so nobody could drag her under again. And the first thing she did wasn't return to the ballroom to listen to polished, empty apologies. It was to find Margot, because Kayla understood that a basement door opening at exactly the right moment couldn't be pure luck. Margot wasn't standing in the middle of the crowd. She was in a side corridor near a private waiting room, where heavy drapes dulled the light and the music became only an echo. She was still flawless in a dark dress, pearls straight at her throat, a glass in her hand like a symbol. And when Kayla appeared, Margot's gaze touched her without surprise, the look of someone assessing a problem that needed to be handled. Kayla walked straight into that private pocket of air, didn't bow, didn't call her mother, only said Margot in a voice polite enough not to ignite a shouting match, and asked one clipped question. "You recognized me from the start. Why?" Margot lifted the glass to her lips, still didn't drink, and replied that Kayla didn't belong here, that people like Kayla didn't understand the rules of the game, and that very ignorance was what made her dangerous for Grant. Kayla didn't argue about belonging. She asked what Margot had done to protect her legacy, and Margot gave a small laugh, not joyful, only contempt dressed as composure, and said plainly she didn't hate Kayla because Kayla was ugly or because Kayla was bad. She hated her because Kayla was uncontrollable, a girl who'd come out of the foster system carrying poor stories and real needs always dirtied clean banquets. Margot said Grant had built his whole life so nobody could touch a weakness, and Kayla had appeared like a weakness that breathed, that demanded rights, that looked people in the eye. She said this world could forgive sin if sin was packaged beautifully, but it couldn't forgive poverty, because poverty forced them to look back at the way they lived. Kayla listened without flushing. She only nodded, because sometimes the truth was brutally simple. And then she asked about Darius Crown, the name released like a hook dropped into deep water, and for the first time Margot faltered, just slightly. so fast another person might have missed it. But Kayla had lived her whole life reading small shifts in faces to know when to stay quiet and when to press. Margot recovered at once and said Kayla was imagining things, that whatever happened downstairs was logistics, malfunction, chaos Kayla herself had created. And Kayla answered no, it was a service route opened at the right door, at the right hour, in the right dead zone, and someone had called people in the way you scheduled an appointment. Margot looked at Kayla longer, weighing whether this girl was more contemptible or more dangerous, then said in a terrifyingly calm voice that Kayla should be grateful everything was still controlled, that if Margot truly wanted Kayla gone, Kayla wouldn't be standing here, and that sentence made Kayla go cold, not because it threatened, but because it accidentally admitted Margot's hand had been on the board. Kayla didn't let emotion get ahead of her. She kept her phone in her coat pocket, her finger quietly holding record from before she'd stepped into this corridor, because she knew the best truth was truth that spoke in the speaker's own voice. Margot continued, like she was lecturing, saying Darius Crown was only a name people like Kayla liked to use to create a story. But then she carelessly dropped something too specific. She said all you needed was the west door open during the shift change window, and you could do plenty without anyone upstairs hearing, and that she'd ask someone to make sure that route stayed clear, because she didn't want her bloodline dragged into a labor scandal. The words fell like a stone that sank, and Kayla knew she'd gotten what she needed most. A link between Margot and the access that had enabled Crown. Kayla looked at her, her voice calm to the point of cold, and said Margot had just confirmed she interfered with the service route that led to the incident, and any lawyer would understand what that meant when someone nearly got hurt. Margot narrowed her eyes and asked if Kayla was threatening her. Kayla said no, she was setting a boundary. From now on, every contact between them would go through attorneys. Every message, every call, every piece of advice would be documented, and if anything else happened that touched Jade or Jonah, Kayla would hand every shred of evidence to the appropriate agency. When Kayla turned to leave, Margot threw one final line like a blade in the back, that Grant would always choose blood. Kayla didn't turn around. She only said blood couldn't be an excuse for sin, and walked out of the side corridor toward the suite. Grant was standing at the far end like he'd been waiting, his eyes scanning Kayla's face to read the outcome. Kayla didn't explain at length. She only let him hear a short recording, just enough for Margot to reveal her contempt and the detail about the service route. Grant listened, his expression barely shifting, but his jaw tightened like steel under heat. He was silent for a few seconds, then told Miles that from this point forward, Margot was not to approach Kayla in any form. All communication had to go through legal counsel, and if his mother tried to cross that line, he'd cut her access to anything connected to the hotel in the event. Kayla watched him, waiting for the moment he would hesitate, soften, choose family. But Grant only looked straight at her and said very quietly that tonight she'd already chosen, and so had he, and then he stepped slightly to the side, as if clearing the path for Kayla to walk first. A small gesture, but enough for Kayla to understand he'd just chosen her over blood, not with a vow, but with an action that carried consequences. When they returned to the ballroom, the air felt like a room where someone had opened a door and let cold wind pour in. People still stood in clusters, still held their glasses, but the smiles had lost their confidence, because words like audit, data sealing, and suspension had stripped the glamour of its harmless mask. Grant didn't step onto a stage. He didn't need to. He simply signaled the operations manager to gather the relevant people right there near the main table. A circle closed enough not to become a show, but open enough that no one could pretend they hadn't heard. Kayla stood half a beat off to the side, not in Grant's shadow, not posed as a rescued symbol. She kept her phone in her hand, not raised, just ready if she needed it. And when eyes started turning toward her like they were waiting for a scene, Kayla didn't give them a scene. She delivered the truth, clipped and procedural, like a written statement. She said this wasn't a morality story, not a speech about kindness. This was about hours being altered, tips being withheld, workers being threatened with cut shifts, and a staffing agency being used like a baton to keep people silent. She didn't tell her life story. She didn't parade suffering. She opened a photo folder and forwarded it to the third-party audit representative who'd just arrived, with a copy sent to Human Resources, showing timesheets scratched out and rewritten in a different hand, short retaliatory notes like cut hours, let go, send back to the agency, tip summaries with blank gaps, and amounts marked kept back for no stated reason. and a coded delivery schedule tucked into vendor paperwork that didn't match legitimate invoices, all photographed clearly, time-stamped, with the log payroll room visible in context. She added that the first person targeted tonight hadn't been her. It had been Jade Rios, a single mother working the dessert station, targeted as a way to shut someone up, and Kayla didn't describe the violence in detail. She only said Jade had been pulled into a dangerous situation at the freight elevator area and then called down to the basement again under the excuse of procedure. And if someone hadn't intervened in time, tonight could have produced an accident while the gala upstairs stayed smooth. The guests standing nearby began to change color. Because the word accident landed harder than the word criminal, it made responsibility feel closer. And Kayla used that exact point. She didn't curse anyone out. She didn't call anyone a monster. She only asked one question that made people uncomfortable, because it demanded an answer inside their own chest. If a cut shift meant an empty refrigerator, if a stolen tip meant a prescription left unfilled, who here dared to call that a misunderstanding? The auditor flipped through the material quickly, asked the operations manager about access to the log payroll room, about the payroll system logs, about the list of badge holders, and those technical questions clamped down on every lie like steel, because they pulled the story out of emotion and into numbers. Brielle stood at the edge of the circle, trying to keep her face composed, but her eye twitched. She tried to push in and say Kayla was only a temporary worker with a grudge, that she was attempting blackmail, that she was unstable. But Kayla didn't fight with emotion. Kayla only looked straight at Brielle and said Brielle had accused her of stealing and extortion in front of human resources and hotel security. And now was the moment for Brielle to produce evidence, because if Brielle couldn't, that accusation would be treated as a deliberate smear meant to cover labor violations. Brielle forced a smile and said she had witnesses, but when the auditor asked for names and written statements, Brielle started circling, talking about the situation, about event safety, about image, and Kayla watched the mask crack because it couldn't survive a form-based question. The human resources manager looked at Cynthia, suspended and standing off to the side like a shadow, then looked back at Brielle, and for the first time that night, the system people understood this was no longer a game of humiliating a girl at the dish station. This was legal exposure that could collapse their jobs. Kayla didn't press for drama. She ended with one clear demand, that the hotel immediately guarantee the preservation of all data, protect workers from retaliation, and protect Jade from being turned into a sacrificial body. Because if anyone here thought they could bury this by firing a temporary worker, they didn't understand how evidence worked. Inside that circle, there was no confession of love, no romantic scene, only silence heavy as stone as people realized their elegance was standing on stolen hours. And when Kayla stood there, not crying, not begging, only presenting the truth cleanly and in structure, the ballroom witnessed a different kind of power for the first time, the power of someone dismissed as small who still knew how to use paperwork to force the powerful to answer. Once the circle of truth had been built under the crystal lights, everything else became a chain reaction nobody could rewind. The third-party auditors immediately demanded that all data tied to hours worked and tip reporting be sealed. The hotel's legal team was pulled in that very night, and the people who'd laughed at Kayla's humiliation started checking their watches as if time could rescue them from consequence. Kayla didn't wait for anyone to grant her mercy. She stepped out of the crowd, opened her phone, and used the secure channel Simone Park had left behind, sending a data package that included the coded delivery schedule, the irregular vendor invoices, the payroll log pages marked with edits and retaliatory notes, along with a short audio clip that was enough to point to interference with the service route that had opened the path for the basement intrusion. Kayla didn't write a long explanation. She only stated that these were traces of money laundering routed through event logistics with links to Darius Crown's people, and she requested protective activation for Jonah and Jade exactly as agreed. Park responded faster than Kayla expected, not with sweet promises, but with a string of dry, real actions. A conditional protection plan was activated. Jonah was moved into a priority follow-up schedule, and his health coverage was confirmed through a legitimate channel. Jade was pulled away from the dangerous work route and placed onto a safer job track with legal support designed to prevent retaliation, and for the first time in Kayla's life, she felt a system moving for the safety of someone like her, even though the price was that she'd just stepped into a dark zone where every choice carried risk. At the Castellane, Cynthia's access badge was taken, and she was escorted into an office with human resources and attorneys. No longer able to hide behind a commanding tone, because the system logs and camera footage had been preserved under Grant's orders, The pages Kayla photographed became something that couldn't be denied, and when the auditors cross-checked against POS data and shift schedules, the story stopped being word against word and became a pattern of misconduct, from wage fraud and tip theft to obstruction of internal inquiry and manipulation of workers through the staffing agency, enough to pull criminal exposure for fraud and interference. Brielle tried to run. She tried to twist it into a misunderstanding. She tried to summon donor sympathy with a smile and talk of image, but her image was crushed by the documents themselves. Event contracts began to freeze. A few partners quietly canceled future collaborations. The people who'd stood beside her at the bar moved away like they feared a smell. Because in New York, society can forgive cruelty if it stays hidden, but it doesn't forgive litigation risk that can drag names into the light. Still, the true price didn't sit with Cynthia or Brielle. It sat with the fact that Crown would understand someone had touched his line tonight. And when someone like Crown felt threatened, he didn't respond with an explosion. He responded with pressure. Calls from blocked numbers. Messages with no words. Doors that used to open suddenly shutting. People who'd been neutral suddenly dodging. And Kayla felt the city remain wide while the corridors narrowed, as if the dark was reclaiming its boundaries. Grant kept the gala from collapsing that night. He controlled the noise so the public would only see an operational issue being handled. But behind the carpet, he was already repositioning people, changing the security routes, locking doors that previously required only a phone call to open, and Kayla could see his world running like a war machine wrapped in velvet. Later, in the suite, when things had temporarily settled, Grant didn't act tender to beg forgiveness, and he didn't issue commands to keep her. He sat across from Kayla as if accepting a private trial. He said Crown wouldn't stop because of one failed night. He said his mother had gone too far, and he'd cut her access. He admitted just enough truth that Kayla didn't have to stitch it together from fragments anymore, that he wasn't an ordinary man, that the world he moved through had its own laws, and he'd tried to keep Kayla outside that zone for as long as he could. Kayla listened without softening into surrender, and without hardening into something pointless. She only asked the right questions, about Jonah, about Jade, about the right to leave that had been signed, about any remaining secrets that could touch someone else's safety. Because if they could, she had to know. Grant accepted those questions like a new condition of the marriage. No longer the smooth comfort of ignorance, only truth stretched tight as a string, where every day they stayed beside each other would be a day that pulled them closer and kept them wary at the same time. They didn't reconcile with promises. They stepped into a new, tense honesty. Kayla held paperwork like a shield and held her mind like a weapon. Grant kept distance when she demanded it, while tightening his position against Crown. And in the silence between them, Kayla understood that the night at the Castellane had slammed shut the door to her old life and opened a marriage with no easy answers, only hard choices and consequences that would follow like footsteps in a corridor that never slept. The days after the night at the Castellane didn't move like a victorious ending. They moved like a house that had just been torn through by a storm, where you had to pick up each piece, wipe each stain, and ask yourself what could still be used and what had to be thrown away. And Kayla returned to Queens with a new kind of calm, not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid anymore, but the calm of someone who knew fear would stay for a long time and she just wouldn't let it drive for her anymore. On the first morning, she woke before the alarm, listening to the traffic outside like a reminder that the city didn't care who had just survived. She made weak coffee, checked her phone for any strange messages, then wrote 3 things down on paper like a ritual to keep her mind from cracking. Take Jonah to his follow-up appointment. Call Jade back. Review the documents Miles had sent copies of. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, shoulders thin, eyes still heavy with sleep. But when Kayla said they were going to the clinic today, she didn't have to speak like she was begging fate the way she used to. She spoke like someone with an appointment confirmed, insurance activated, medication approved, and that alone made Jonah breathe out a little easier, as if part of the weight had been lifted off his chest. On the way to the clinic, Kayla still flinched when a horn blared. Her heart still sped up when a strange man walked too close on the sidewalk. Her nervous system couldn't tell the difference between a basement and a city street, between a real threat and a passing shadow. But she didn't let herself run. She only did the simplest thing. She took a deep breath, counted the beats, put her hand on the pocket where the paperwork and her phone sat, and reminded herself that today she had a plan. And a plan was how she pulled herself out of panic. At the clinic, the nurse called Jonah's name. This time, Kayla didn't have to wait in the fear of being questioned about money. The doctor spoke about the treatment protocol in a professional voice, and Kayla asked the right questions about side effects, about the follow-up schedule, about the number to call if something went wrong. She listened like a legal guardian, not like someone begging for the right to keep living. And Jonah looked at her with an expression that was both startled and lighter, like he was believing for the first time that his sister wasn't only enduring, she was steering. Jade called back that afternoon, her voice still carrying the fracture of fear. But she said Park had arranged a safer work track for her, no longer pushed into back-of-house areas where accidents could be staged, with legal support so the staffing agency couldn't threaten to cut her shifts without cause, and with a clear contact person if she felt like she was being watched. Kayla listened without loud celebration. She only told Jade she had to keep everything on paper, save every message, take screenshots, treat self-protection like part of the job. And Jade went quiet for a moment before saying thank you. Not thank you for money, but thank you because for the first time someone was treating her life like it was worth building a system around. That night, Kayla opened the documents again, reading each clause the way you read an escape map. The private account had been opened. The right to leave was active. Jonah's medical plan had been triggered, and she noticed something strange. Safety didn't arrive like a light snapping on. It arrived like small habits repeated, checking the locks, placing the phone in the same spot, agreeing on passwords, not talking about important things in places where someone could listen, sleeping on time when she could, eating full meals even when she didn't feel hungry. Grant called late one night. He didn't ask where she was. He didn't order her to do anything. He only asked if Jonah was stable, asked if Jade had been placed, then said that if Kayla needed him not to show up, he wouldn't show up. If Kayla needed distance, he'd keep it. And the words sounded simple, but from a man like Grant, they were a disciplined choice. Kayla didn't soften right away, and she didn't go colder just to prove she was strong. She only said she needed time, and she needed the truth in pieces she could bear. Grant said he understood, then ended the call before it could turn into a tug-of-war, not using silence as punishment, not using money as a sedative, only leaving a clean space for Kayla to breathe on her own. When night came down, Kayla lay staring at the queen's ceiling, much lower than the ceiling of a hotel suite, but it was her ceiling. She listened to Jonah shifting in the next room, listened to the small hum of the refrigerator, and she knew her nervous system still didn't believe in peace. And maybe it wouldn't for a long time, but she also knew she'd begun to live by her own rhythm, the rhythm of boundaries, the rhythm of paperwork, the rhythm of small habits that kept her standing upright, and somewhere far off, even if she didn't want to admit it. Grant keeping his distance when she asked for it was the first sign that protection could exist without becoming possession. The weeks after that didn't offer a single moment big enough to be called reconciliation. There were only small days stitched together like careful sutures, and Kayla understood that if trust ever came back, it would come back that way, through quiet details, not through a tear-soaked apology or an expensive gift. Grant didn't show up in Queens unless she invited him. He didn't send flowers. He didn't hire someone to trail her for protection. He didn't turn concern into a leash. He only sent a message on time before Jonah's follow-up appointment, asking if she needed a car. And when Kayla said no, he stopped immediately. No extra questions, no sulking, as if he was learning a new rule that sometimes respect meant standing still. Kayla didn't perform gratitude either. She didn't text sweetness to make him comfortable. She answered only what needed answering, the right thing, the right information, and kept the rest for herself, because she'd paid too much for making other people feel safe by swallowing her own voice. But even inside that coldness, there was still a pull, dangerous and real, like electricity running underwater. Kayla felt it every time Grant called, his voice low, sparing, not trying to seduce and still changing the air. She felt it every time she remembered his hand settling on a man's shoulder in the basement and the entire corridor going silent. She hated that she was still dragged by that power. She hated it because it made her feel fragile. But she didn't deny it. She only held it down, measured it, put it behind her boundaries the way you sheath a knife, because she understood that desire left unmanaged became another form of self-harm. Jonah slowly stabilized. He ate more. He slept deeper. When he saw Kayla no longer spiraling at paperwork, he feared life a little less. Jade started working somewhere safer, no longer pushed into the hotel's dark corridors, and sometimes she texted Kayla a short line that she still startled sometimes, but she was learning how to breathe again. Kayla kept her promise to herself. She found a short course in compliance and worker protection, not to become a hero, but because she'd seen how evidence could save people when it was organized correctly, and she wanted to turn her survival instincts into something structured, something with legal language, something that could stand in court if it had to. She sat in evening classes, listening to audit procedures, labor law, how to document retaliation, how to protect witnesses inside a workplace. And strangely, she felt calmer learning dry things, because dry things couldn't be weaponized through emotion. Grant didn't interfere with her choices. He only asked Miles to send her a list of scholarships and legitimate training programs, then stopped, no pressure to accept. And Kayla realized, for the first time, help could be offered without demanding an invisible price. At the Castellane, changes began quietly. No press release, no stage, just structure forced back into alignment. Tip reporting moved onto a more transparent platform. Schedules and timesheets were locked behind clear access permissions. Regular audits were put in place. The staffing agency contracts were reviewed. Threatening clauses were stripped out. Shift supervisors were replaced. An anonymous reporting program was created so workers could report retaliation without throwing themselves into the fire. Kayla wasn't there to witness it, but a former kitchen contact told her that for the first time they'd seen an owner order hours protected the way a safe was protected, and Kayla knew that whatever Grant's deeper motives were, she'd forced his world through a narrower gate, one where power couldn't casually step on the weak without leaving a trace. That truth didn't soften her right away, but it made her feel less meaningless, less like she was only a glitch in someone else's legacy. One night, Grant came to Queens because Kayla invited him. No entourage, no controlling gaze. He stood outside the door like a man waiting for permission. Jonah opened it and looked at him with curiosity mixed with caution. Grant only nodded hello, not trying to buy goodwill, and Kayla saw a different kind of discipline there. The discipline of a man used to giving orders who was learning how to ask. They sat in the small kitchen and said what needed saying, not what sounded good. And in the silences between them, Kayla felt that pull still there. Dangerous but measured. Not turning her into prey, not turning him into an owner. Only two adults standing inside a dark world, trying to build something like trust out of small bricks and boundaries that were actually honored. The epilogue didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like a report signed through the proper process, and a routine repeated long enough that fear no longer controlled anyone's breathing. After the gala night, the Castellane didn't just swap a few faces and return to business as usual. It was forced to build a new system, because everything had been examined under the hard light of audits and legal scrutiny. Work hours and tips were tracked through a more transparent platform. Access to the data room was locked down with strict logging. The staffing agency was bound by anti-intimidation and anti-retaliation clauses. An anonymous reporting channel was established, so workers could speak up without having their shifts cut. A benefits pathway funded through a lawful structure was built like a safe road forward, not as a favor from an owner, but as a mechanism that could be checked, measured, and held accountable. Kayla didn't become a queen in a ballroom. She kept her life in Queens. She kept her personal account in her own name. She kept the written right to leave in a drawer she could touch any time, just to remind herself that love didn't include captivity. Jonah stabilized, and follow-up appointments were no longer a desperate race against money. He began to have days that actually looked like youth again. He could laugh without apologizing for making his sister worry, and Kayla learned how to live with memory without letting memory drive every decision. She worked quietly but steadily in compliance and worker protection, using her own experience to understand what other people needed and what kind of evidence they needed to be protected under the law. Grant was still Grant, ruthless with his enemies and not soft toward manipulation, but he began to be bound by the rules he had chosen to sign, by Kayla's boundaries, by the truth that if he wanted to keep her in his life, he had to respect her freedom the way he respected his own power. He didn't become a gentle man. He became a man who knew restraint, who could let distance exist when Kayla needed it, who could turn power into responsibility instead of using it like a cage. The warmth of the ending wasn't fairy tale warmth. It was the warmth of discipline, of on-time schedules, of clear paperwork, of small actions repeated again and again until people stopped flinching at the sound of a door opening. And the human lesson sat right there. Sometimes what saves a person isn't a miracle, but a boundary written down, a truth spoken at the right moment, and a system built so the vulnerable don't have to endure alone. If you've walked with Kayla this far, remember that in real life, nobody deserves to be looked down on for being poor. Nobody deserves to have their labor taken through intimidation, and anyone has the right to set boundaries to protect themselves and the people they love. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share, so we have the motivation to bring you more compelling stories every day. And how do you feel about this story? Have you ever had to stay calm to save yourself? Or had to choose boundaries instead of silence in real life? Leave a comment so we can hear what's in the deepest part of your heart. Hello, and see you again in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.